So welcome back to the Behind Open Doors podcast, where we take you behind the scenes to discover what it takes to multiply followers, leaders, and churches. So I'm here with Nick Lombardi, president of Multiply. I am Aaron Denny, your host today, executive director of Multiply, and we've got some good stuff to talk about today that sort of begins to put some flesh on what we do here at Multiply. So it's going to be a little bit about us and what we do, but I think also tying it to kind of the history of maybe why we do what we do and how churches have worked together over years and years and years of time as well. We're talking about capacity building today. So Nick, this is your kind of area of insight, at least in my book. I may have introduced you to some followership lingo, but you introduced me to this like capacity building lingo. And so now we want to connect the two today in some ways and say, we want to help churches build their capacity to follow Jesus. But what in the world does capacity building mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, capacity has kind of become a buzzword in the
Is that why you chose it?
That's not.
Oh, okay.
I was actually, it was almost reluctantly kind of went down that path because it's become such a buzzword. Sometimes like money will become available to organizations that are trying to increase their capacity, that kind of. So then you get a bunch of people that are like, oh yeah, capacity, and it switches. Discipleship's been one for a long time. That's kind of the key word. But I'm not totally sure where it came from, to be honest. But I think something that I've noticed about it is, since we've started discussing it, is that it's an interesting solution in the church world in particular, because in the religious context, you have a lot of issues around congregational autonomy, denominationalism, and things of that nature. Capacity is special because it allows for growth. It allows for growth through connection and unity, but it also allows for autonomy, right? So when we talk about capacity, I'm thinking of in autonomous churches, growth in the autonomous church's ability to do things autonomously, right? Whereas, which is really quite, because we need that, right? Like if you're in your Baptist context, if you're working with Baptist denominations or any of the Congregationalists that are like, we really hold our autonomy, it's got to be that, and we don't want to lean on a bishop or a denomination or something forever. That's a real issue for non-denominational or Baptist churches around the world that are trying to kind of go at it themselves. If you come alongside them and say, well, we'll give you money, we'll give you resources, we'll build capacity through those things, but it's a denominational structure, therefore we all kind of grow together, then that becomes a major issue and they're kind of left out. So when we talk about capacity, I'm thinking, at least I am thinking of the tools, systems, and processes that can be installed. I find the mobile app, like the computer language, is somehow helpful with this, but it's sort of like you'd install a program in your computer, maybe, a system of these processes,
like on MS
programs.
DOS, back in the day, that kind of installation.
I think things still get installed, right? Like,
I guess
they get downloaded and then installed.
Right.
It happens so fast. It's not.
Right, exactly.
It used to be when we were kids and our first computers, it was like installation could take a whole day or whatever. So it was a bigger deal. But
NASCAR 94 on the old IBM compact thing, like that took a day, and then the track package took longer.
Yeah,
it was an old thing.
Miserable. So yeah, if you think of installation, it's like, okay, these systems are implemented into what can be an autonomous church or an organization, and then the capacity for that church grows in what they can accomplish, what they can do for the kingdom. Of course, the family of churches grows in that way, because anytime a church grows in capacity, the whole family grows in capacity, but not in a way that interferes with the local church.
So can we just even back up a little bit further? Like, what does the word capacity mean? Like, with what is capacity? I think of like a flux capacitor, right? Or like something that's you have the capacity to do this, the capacity to do that. Like, what are we really talking about at the guts of it there?
That's the first time I realized that the flux capacitor was related to capacity.
Really? So when I think of capacitor, like I did engineering for like a semester, so I'm like a professional at all this stuff,
yeah,
right?
you know.
So electrical engineering at that.
Wow.
So I know that a capacitor is a thing, right? But my guess is a capacitor somehow amplifies power in an electrical sense, maybe. We're going off the rails here a little bit, probably,
Yeah.
but my guess is it takes power and sort of distributes it and amplifies it in some ways.
Yeah, wow.
Isn't that true? Mostly, I mean, that's what a flux capacitor. That was that Y-shaped thing in the deal, right?
The capacity to flux.
1.221 gigawatts of
yeah.
power. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Learning a lot on this podcast. So when I think of capacity, I think of the ability to increase the volume of work or whatever the
Production
output
or whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So if you can, if you have one person on your team and that person has the ability to output certain amount of widgets, right? If you're on a manufacturing line, let's say, if you add two people, now you've increased the capacity to output more.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully by double, but
yeah.
You know, that kind
So it could be capacity can also be somewhat. Yeah, maybe stagnant in some ways too. Maybe like because if we think about like what's the capacity of this bathtub or something like that, right? Like the capacity is a certain amount of gallons of water, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it can hold that much.
Yeah.
But we're talking about like building capacity, so it's more about not a stagnant capacity of what something can hold. It's rather what something can produce. Yeah. Yes.
I think so.
I think so too.
Yeah. Increase in volume of something.
Yeah.
Because you could like reinforce the legs of that tub, and then it could hold more water. In that way, you're increasing.
If you increase the volume of the tub, sure. Yeah.
Well, assuming you're assuming it's filled to the top.
I was. Yes, you're right. You're right. See.
Didn't say that.
That's true. Interesting. So with the capacity building in the church setting, or a ministry setting, like we tend to talk meta, like big, like church and churches and church planting. But I mean, if you're a ministry leader listening to this, like your ministry has a certain capacity, and you have a certain amount of capacity to lead in your ministry.
Yeah.
And we're saying we want to help build that capacity, and we do that in some particular ways. What are the two big ways that we do that?
Well, we do it in ministry and in mission.
Mm-hmm.
All right, ministry capacity, mission capacity, and I think there are words. Those are our phrases, but I think they work sort of in a common sense way as well. So ministry capacity is the stuff. I'm trying to think of an analogy back to tubs, but it's not going to happen. I think
At least it's not birds this time.
Yeah, birds. Oh, I should add another bird one. A bird capacity. It's the ability to operate as a ministry, right? It's the things that you need to do to keep your church operating healthy and moving, not even necessarily assuming growth. Right, like it's the shepherding, yes, but it's like the things that you need to do to get to the care for the people. So I think of, if you don't handle your finances correctly, if you don't have the bookkeeping done, if you don't pay whoever you got to pay, make sure your lease gets paid, that kind of stuff, then you're not going to have a ministry, at least if how it looks at that time. So those are ministry duties, ministry things that have to get done, and they can take up a lot of your time, especially if you're a small, under-resourced church.
Yeah, for sure. And so building one's ministry capacity might mean, in our case, it means taking away that responsibility in some ways, or at least the task-oriented kind of things, taking some of those things away in order to free up space or capacity or margin, however you want to say that, for this person to do ministry, a church leader to do ministry, a pastor to do ministry. If I got to spend my time, like you said, figuring out how people are going to get paid versus going and actually discipling somebody and sitting down and working through the scriptures, and like we want more of that to happen, more of the sitting in a coffee shop and learning the Bible one-on-one with people and building somebody's discipleship capacity and their capacity to follow Jesus. We want to see more of that happen. So whatever we can pull off of the shoulders of some of these churches and some of these leaders that we're working with, that's a big goal behind what we're trying to do, for sure.
Yeah, I think that this is closely related to like the idea of leverage, which has been around in ministries for a little while now, where we want churches to leverage our centralized staff to create more room, more capacity in their lives and their ministries. To first care, I think would first care for the church itself, right? If you're a pastor who is spending 75% of your time graphic design, bookkeeping, finances, administration, so on and so forth, you guys know the list very well. Then you're only getting 25% of your time to care for, teach your people, to do the work of the ministry, equipping the saints stuff. Then really, first and foremost, you should leverage the central staff of Multiply to create time so that becomes something more like 75% doing those things and then 25% doing the administrative stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some scriptural backing for this, right? Some scriptural, at least maybe not prescriptive but descriptive examples that we see. Is it the same thing as the end of Acts chapter 2 where they had all things in common and they sold their possessions and gave to anyone who had need? Is it the same type of thing as that?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. I don't. I think so. I think we're the church today. There's such a pull towards autonomy, independence, especially in the Western church. Where like in America, I mean, being the independent, self-sustaining, self-earning, unit of one is like the epitome of being a man, right? Like the Bible deconstructs that entirely, that narrative.
Yeah.
I think. The picture of the Bible, and I think you could get into like, well, is it just, and this is kind of where I've gotten stuck in the past, is like, well, is it just for local people in the immediate setting? And I don't think that's the case. I think there's places in the Bible where it goes beyond even the local, and where believers are encouraged to think more globally, to think about your brother or sister that's in another city and could be suffering, and what is the part you play.
Yeah, and at least we do have examples of that as well. And 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, that whole section in there where Paul's talking about taking up an offering to help the Jerusalem church. He's going around to all these different churches on his missionary journeys to collect offering that they're going to eventually take back to Jerusalem, because the Jerusalem church was struggling. I think there was a famine or something going on, right?
So they were under-resourced.
Yeah, they were under-resourced, exactly.
Famine, yeah.
Yeah, so the collection came around from these other churches to help this Jerusalem church. And while that may be more of the type of thing we're talking about, because they were collecting resources to resource an under-resourced church so that under-resourced church could better care for its people and reach more people for Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in Acts, there's this incredible kind of, people are selling off their stuff, I think, for the church, experiencing so much. The church was experiencing a lot of change in the different places it was then. We probably experience even more now. We just don't look at it that way. But the resources were being pooled so that, and people selling off stuff. I think about, it's challenging, right? You think about, well, if in our own city there are churches that can't pay their bills, they're losing their building, they can't train a pastor and have a leadership. Am I willing to sell my land? Which that's what was happening back then. Right? Can I sell my land, my home, to make sure that church is able to do what God has called them to do. That's how serious of a thing it's kind of presented.
Yeah.
And it was new to them.
Yeah.
It's not even that new to us.
Yeah.
I once heard somebody say that like that everyone's a communist in their own home. And I thought, man, that's kind of brilliant actually, because I think you could extend that a bit further, that in the religious context, like we should all, especially in America, again, we're that independent, self-resourcing kind of capitalist man. I think that's all great at the national level or at the socioeconomic in the industries and stuff. But in a certain respect, like when my family, right, I don't ever say to my son who's 4, like, you didn't earn that second chicken nugget today, right? It's like what's mine is yours. There's an equal distribution of everything when it comes down to somebody in need. I think it should be that way when it comes to the church as well. That just like you wouldn't, I'm going to eat tonight, but my family's not because they didn't work hard enough, right? I think we should have a similar kind of care for the church.
Yeah, definitely. So we have this ministry capacity that we believe needs to be built in the church. And in that ministry capacity, I think it's helpful for those of you that might be listening that aren't in this area, aren't totally connected to Multiply. I think it's helpful just to kind of rethink the whole autonomous independence kind of thing. And I'm not saying we have to completely do away with it. I'm happy to be part of a church that is able to make its own decisions, but that glad cooperation with one another and the one anothering of the churches, I think is so important today, and particularly in the West, because that's our context, that's what we know. And I just wonder, is some of this, some of the capacity building and some of the idea of sharing and collaboration and all that kind of stuff is somewhat driven by, I think, our personalities in some way. Like we like that. We like when we get to work together with other churches and other people and other leaders and learn from one another. But honestly too, like the churches that we're a part of here in Hampton Roads area, they're not considerably wealthy churches, right? Like we've had to claw and scratch and grab to get to where we're at. And so some of the pooling of resources was by necessity. Like we had to do that. And I think what we found is that other churches feel very similar. Like we don't all have that giant resourced church just funding missions everywhere. And when you come out of that environment, I think you have less of a proclivity towards collaboration and sharing because you've got everything you need. I think. Is that accurate? Is that true?
Well, I think it goes back to kind of what we're talking about, the Western cultural pressure to just be fiercely independent. That the more, and this I think is a problem today in our culture, like the more independent, the better, right? Like the military used to have a slogan that was like, or the army was an army of one. Now it's something like we celebrate diversity. Like you need both, because if everyone just kind of goes their own separate way and does their own separate thing, and we have to get independent at any cost, then I think that could really in the church context, I think that could really damage the global church. I think we need more people to examine themselves, and it's not comfortable. It's not fun, right? Especially if you're a more type A kind of pastor, and you're like, well, what does it look like for me to plant a church in a hard place and give up the idea maybe of being that strong, independent, I can do everything church, and just be like, no, I'm a church. I'm humble enough to realize that I'm the church in Jerusalem. Yeah. I'm the church that maybe for the next 10 years, I'm going to need help from a different church. Yeah. And then you come to the realization, well, it's like, we don't have a lot of mega churches in Norfolk. I don't know, we have any mega churches in Norfolk. So it's not going to be one church that is going to be able to, be that those church. You need to do it together. Yeah. If we don't do it together, we're never going to go to those hard places where it's not sustainable in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important. And so again, it's trying to apply this to to folks listening that might not be in this area, might not have any direct cooperation with Multiply, I think the learning point here is like, what can you do to work with other ministries, work with other churches, and just have an open hand?
Mm-hmm.
I heard a guy one time preaching. He said, he's like, close your eyes. I want you to just grip your hands really tight. And so you're supposed to do that, you know. So if you're listening, go ahead and do that right now, right? Grip your hands really tight. And now release that grip. Do you feel the sense of just pressure being alleviated from you, right? So in that way, like we want people to go from this grip tight, everything's in my grasp, I got this, to like collaboration, working together, being open with each other's resources, knowing that what I have and maybe what I've earned or what I've gotten over all these years doesn't really belong to me anyway. This is the church that Jesus said that he would build, and we are mere stewards of it. I think you mentioned humility. Humility is almost like the assumed foundation of this, is that we have to approach this in humility. And by the way, if you're maybe a leader and you're like, I don't know how this works, I'm telling you, if you go into these kind of conversations with your church members, with people that you're considering working with, if you go into these conversations with that kind of humility, you will quickly expose those who are not. You'll find the people that you want to work with pretty quickly, because when you trickled into our little coffee shop and was just like, yeah, we're looking to plant a church, and the girl that worked there was like, well, I know these guys here that are doing that. Like, we met each other, and it was almost immediate, like, oh, this dude has a humility that is going to be needed to work together at some point in the future, right? Yeah. I think that's generally true. If you lead with humility and start with humility, you're going to quickly find those who are on the same page with you.
Yeah. And like you said, you're going to find those that want to take advantage of you, and those are the
yeah,
ones.
Yeah.
No thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't like you.
Yeah, I remember early on, many years ago, before we even, so this must have been 5 years ago, at least 5 years ago. Chris and I, the other elder at the time at TGC, were considering getting our first public meeting space, and the cafe, of course. And we were just praying about it, trying to figure out, is this the right thing to do? And you and a few other people, I think some of the elders, came down to the property. It was like a huge construction site at that point. They didn't even have like a paved road in the front yet. And you just said, I was like, what do you think? What do you think here? And you're like, well, you looked at you looked at the numbers and that kind of stuff, and you knew what our numbers were. And you're like, well, I can tell you, like, we've got your back, I think is what you said. We've got your back. And you said something along the lines of like, we're not going to let you fail because, you can't make the lease or something. And that was it. And Chris and I said, all right, let's do it. I don't know if the hundreds and hundreds of people that a very large Dura church that's meeting tonight in someone's house, I don't know if any of that would have happened, if any of those people would have get reached, if you hadn't said that, and if we hadn't humbly,
wow,
that's the truth of it. So that's the power. And I think that leads to so I think the idea there is that if we can humbly work together, leverage each other's assets, and especially Multiply Central to create ministry capacity, then what we're going to see is a growth in how many people we can reach. That's a new area that we've had a presence in for over 4 years now because of that start, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and then that helps us build what we call mission capacity, right? The ministry capacity is usually the first needs for existing churches and existing ministries involved. But mission capacity, though, is really the stuff that truly advances the mission of God. So we're talking about developing new followers, new disciples. We're talking about developing leaders. We're talking about residency that develops church planters and church leaders and missional leaders that are going to be marketplace leaders, those kinds of things. That develops the mission capacity side of things. So talk about that for a second, and it's kind of our angle there.
Yeah. So mission capacity would be the way I think about it is, okay, you've got some breathing room, ministry capacity room there. Sometimes I think if we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes the need there is for a little break or rest or something. It's like, okay, I don't have to do all the graphic design this week, so I'm going to actually take a day to Sabbath. I'm thinking of like church leadership
Hello.
here. Yeah.
What about that?
Hey, heaven forbid, right? Anyway, I'm not going to go into how important Sabbathing is, but maybe you're able to do that for a little while, and then you kind of get your wits about you again. And it's like, okay, what now, right? Like, what now? And the command of God, I think, and the family focus is, well, now let's focus on the mission of God. Okay, but good news. You don't have to go back to, okay, now you've got 75% capacity to focus on the mission stuff, and 25% you're spending on the sort of administration. You don't actually have to now get bogged down in that either, or figure it all out yourself. Instead, we can come alongside you almost immediately and expand the volume of work you can do, the ability, the output that you're able to do, because we've got these mission systems in place. We've got training and mentorship and curriculum and programs and things like that can, again, the way I think about it, is sort of installed on your phone. It's kind of, it can be installed in your church. And of course there's a bunch of customization there and like the principles and all of that kind of stuff. So instead of trying to figure out how to grow and multiply from like, okay, now for the first time maybe in my ministry, I can think about, what does that take? Let me go read 10 books and go back to school. It's like, okay, or we could come alongside you and expand that capacity off the bat.
Yeah, that's great. And we've called this system the 3F system, right? We're building family followers into different fields, 3 Fs. And with this 3F system, we're looking at followership pathways, leadership pathways, multiplication pathways. And the desire here is to, again, as has been our charge, is to equip our churches to multiply followers, leaders, and more churches, right? This is the mission capacity side. And so, we've here at our church, we've been able to start to see some effects of that, where people are getting plugged into resources for discipleship and just being able to pour into one another for discipleship. And that can go a lot of different ways. It can be very customized, like you said. Different seasons and different levels of maturity have different needs. And so we have the ability to help guide you towards the resources you need to help with those needs. If you just go to multiplythechurch.com and go to our equipping tab there, you're going to find a lot of the tools and resources that we use. Not all of them, but a lot of them are there. And it's super helpful just to say, for somebody that says, I don't know how to make disciples, and we're like, cool, we can help with that. And just literally sort of in a package deal say, where are you at? You know, how far along in the faith are you? What sort of resources do you need? All right, cool. We think this will be helpful for you. So that can help. That can be useful on an individual level, like literally just face to face talking to somebody, or on a church-wide church leader level of like, I don't know how to get systems into my church to help people make disciples, and that's on that sort of meta scale. We can help on that level as well. Mm-hmm. And once again, if you're listening and sort of outside this area and all that, we're not trying to sell anything today. We're literally just telling you what we do, and we're truly hoping that it will catch in some ways, and even at least people be thinking about these things and being open-handed with these things, and not being so locked down with the resources that you do have, even if they are proprietary. Like, let's create an open source platform to multiply ministry and mission capacity, you know?
Yeah. It's hard to, for someone that isn't actively in a, like, what's the word? Like a participative environment, or has never experienced one. And I think that's probably most people. It's really hard to articulate the huge benefit that comes with just being in a community that's focused on ministry and mission together, and increasing capacity, increasing ability, or even just has like an eye and a care for others outside of their church. I mean, I can't tell you how many books I've read or scriptures I've been pointed to, or just methodologies that another pastor in the Multiply family has been like, hey, I'm really struggling with what to do with kids during house church. Oh, well, did you know so-and-so over here, this website, this blog did a whole series on, the biblical foundations of children in the sanctuary and how that could, so you have somebody that wants to do a house church. Kids are an issue. Like that's a thing. Like, where do they go? What do you teach them? Do you do the same stuff? Like, well, if you have 5 years, if you're trying to work through that, and then you meet somebody with 5 or 6 years of experience or 10 years of experience figuring it out, it could save you a lot of time. And so, like, it's, there's the 3F system is kind of more of like a formal thing where we can track the progress, and it's systematic, and it's been refined and continues to be refined and things like that. That's a big part of it, a part of mission capacity. I think the community fact and the family effect really also just kind of has that, where it's like, okay, you can gain from years and years of experience from other people just by being in community with them.
Yeah. So what we're saying today is that we really want to help you build your capacity to follow Jesus across the board. Whether you're a church leader, pastor, somebody that's going to be planting a church someday, you're a follower, you're serving in a ministry, whatever the case may be, elevating your capacity to do just that is what I think is helpful and important in today's just busy world. We get bogged down in the busyness of life and different things that may come your way, different circumstances. Once again, back to just resource management and the difficulty that can come into play with managing some of that. But instead, we want to be able to come alongside and say, let's build your capacity to develop followers of Jesus that are going to lead his church, and then to see the gospel multiplied in new churches. We're talking a lot about the West today, but this is happening internationally as well. We've got a lot of international focus with Rwanda, India, and Mexico in our part here, where these systems are also being implemented contextually, mind you, through a catalyst in those particular areas that are able to take a lot of what we have developed and compiled over the years to be able to apply that to their cultural context in a way that is helpful, where they're building ministry and mission capacity in their context as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard you mention followership and kind of the capacity to follow. It remains interesting to me that that the followership is really the start and the end of this whole thing for a church.
Yeah,
can't stress that enough. I think just so few ministries, resourcing ministries, accelerator ministries, they don't focus on that. Why? Because, well, if they're an accelerator, they want to see acceleration. And sometimes followership doesn't look like acceleration right away. That's just the truth of it. Mm-hmm. So it's really the place to start, because I've said this before on this podcast. Multiplication without health is just cancer. And in a lot of ways, I think followership is the cure for that cancer. Mm-hmm. It ensures that what's being multiplied, whether inside of those systems, the capacity that's growing is not capacity for bad things. Yeah. But ultimately, multiplying churches is to the end of creating more followers of Jesus. So it's the place to start, and then it's really the place that's kind of the goal at the end. So super important.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've got a lot of resources on our website. There's an updated About Us section up there now that has a lot of these things lined out in some new and fresh ways, a lot about the ministry and mission capacity there, and even so much more is on that website. And so we're excited to share that with you, anybody listening, and look forward to continuing to build your capacity, sir. And I hope you can build mine as well.
Same.
All right.
Same.
See you next time.